Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this is my Magicka Dragonknight DPS guide. If I did have to pick just one class, I'd probably just by a smidge say DKs are my favorite. I haven't put out a guide in quite some time because I kept saying, well, next time Dragoknights get some major changes, that's when I'll do it. Well, here we are about a year and a half later, so I finally decided I'd just go ahead and do one anyways. MagDKs are actually not as far behind the pack as a lot of people make them out to be. They have really nice cleave damage, and the single target isn't that far behind some of the other heavier hitter setups in the current patch. I feel like with just a few small tweaks to their passives, they could be in a really great spot for PvE DPS, but either way, they're still really fun to play and you can still get really great results with them. And hopefully this guide will help you get the most out of yours. And I am going to start stressing this a bit more in these videos, but please remember, treat this guide as a base to work from. Always make adjustments based on your needs if certain tweaks here or there will get you better results for the specific content you're working on. I'll try to give a lot of options that work well, but I can't possibly cover every scenario in the game. And do make sure to check the description as well. I'll put notes if anything does change from what is presented in this video. So for this guide, I'll go through the top races, our Mundus stone, the top food, drinks, and potions we'll be using, our champion points, the gear options, our skill bars, our rotations, including both an easier plus an advanced setup, and then we'll end with several clips of these sets in action on the trial dummy. One thing before we start, if you want to know how you can help support the channel and keep these guides coming, stop by my Patreon page. I'll have a link in the description. There are ways you can support for as little as $3, and it really does help a lot. I can't thank you all enough that have already signed up. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. So I put this list together using UESP's build editor, so make sure to check that out if you're into theory crafting. The exact numbers on these will change a little based on your specific setup, and those top three may swap around a little bit based on gear and buffs and debuffs present, but in some order, the top three race options from a damage standpoint are High Elf, Dark Elf, and Khajiit. The difference in these three is really tiny. Just a couple of missed light attacks or mess ups in a rotation will make more of a difference than which race you choose of the top three from a damage standpoint. And even if you decide not to go with one of the top three, unless you're trying to get high scores, you can clear any content at a high level with any race option. My MagDK is currently an Imperial on live, and the results I'm getting are more than good enough. And this list is just from a damage point of view. For example, Breton looks to be a tad behind Orc here, but I generally rather be a Breton than an Orc for Magicka DPS due to the really nice side passives that they have that will benefit my sustain. My personal preference right now, if I had to pick just one, is Khajiit, as the damage levels are really good, and they also get a little boost to their health and recovery to go along with it. But really, whichever you prefer can work fine. Onto our Mundus stone, we'll be going with the Thief. The Shadow really only seems better if you are pairing two crit sets together like Mother's Sorrow and Medusa. Shadow can also be really nice for using mechanical acuity on short trash waves, but without a quick and easy way to swap back to the Thief, it's generally better just to run with the Thief for the whole dungeon or trial. For our food, I recommend Bystat Health plus Magicka if you're able to sustain it. It offers great damage with a lot of health, but there is no recovery bonus, so you will be relying on your group a lot for sustain. If that isn't cutting it, for a big boost to sustain and just slightly less damage, you can go with Ghastly Eyeball. This has no health bonus on it, so depending on what content you're doing, you might be a tiny bit more squishy. A nice middle ground between these is Clockwork Citrus Fillet. This is a bit more expensive, but gives some health, magicka, and recovery. So not as much damage as either of the other options though, due to the lower magicka pool. And then there is also a cheaper version of this that gives the same types of stats called Witch Mama's Potty Brew. The stats on it are a little lower than Clockwork, but it can be run if gold is an issue. For our potions, for most scenarios we're using the standard spell power potions. These are generally expected for a DPS to run in veteran encounters, but I'll go over the skill section later, some ways you can set up your bars if you don't want to use these. So either you want to run the trash potions or you can opt for the heroism potions. Heroism pots can be really nice on a DK as their ultimate is pretty expensive and takes a while to build up to, so getting there faster means not only more damage but more sustain too, since the battle roar passive gives us back resources every time we use our ultimate. This is the route I chose to go on the trial dummy for the majority of my parses, as sustain was just a little too rough without it, and several heavy attacks would have been required to get through the parses if I didn't use these. I see some people using spell symmetry as well to sustain on parses. Not my favorite skill to slot as a DPS, but it is an option if you want to go that route for added sustain. So the heroism potions are very expensive though, so I can understand if you don't crap gold and don't want to use these for 99% of content, but if you really are trying to maximize your sustain and damage, they can be really nice. Another interesting option that I wanted to point out with this patch, if you are needing some more sustain, you can run the potions that inflict a spell resistance debuff on you. So there's a new CP node in the fitness tree available called Sustained by Suffering. It gives you 150 extra of each recovery if you have a negative effect on you. These are kind of a meme, as you'd have to avoid purify synergies or else you'd cleanse your negative effect, but actually might work for some solo or 4-man stuff depending on the group comp. I definitely recommend heroism over these, but these are a lot cheaper, so not the best option in the world, but still wanted to bring it up if you are really fighting for every bit of sustain you can get. Okay, so we are on the subject of champion points, so that leads us into our CP section. I'll start with this same node we were just discussing. This does include any negative effect, so it could definitely be worth running for certain encounters, even without those crappy potions where you are going to get negative effects put on you. I'm thinking Locustes. I believe you're technically debuffed the entire encounter, so this should work great there. And even if you're not debuffed or have any kind of negative effect on you for the whole encounter, this could still add some sustain for parts of the encounter, which could make it still worth it. Will be just a bit situational. For our Warfare champion points, I'll go through the slottables here, but for a full guide to setting up all of your CP, make sure to check out the video I made. I cover several different leveling routes and milestones to hit, so I'll have it linked down in the description. So the slottables we'll be taking are Backstabber, Master at Arms, Deadly Aim, and then for that 4th spot, it's really close between Thaumaturge and Fighting Finesse. I really couldn't tell a difference when parsing between the two of these. For situations where you can't slot Backstabber, you'll just slot both Fighting Finesse and Deadly Aim. Then if you do have enough champion points to easily swap your nodes on the fly, I do like to swap in Biting Aura instead of Deadly Aim for the trash waves. Moving on to our gear, I'll go through several setups here which do include some options for those that don't have access to trial gear yet. We'll go through some boss setups, AoE setups, and also a solo build. So I won't be going through the specifics of what each of these sets do. For more info on that and also some other good options that might not be listed here, make sure to check out my top Magicka DPS sets video. I go through all of the top monster sets, arena sets, and 5-piece sets and read through what they do. So this first setup here is the one that got me to 108k DPS on the trial dummy. This is what I found to have the highest top end potential, though it is situational depending on the encounter. So we'll do a 1-piece slime crawl, 5-piece Bahsei's Mania, the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt, and then on the front bar we'll do Mantle of Siroria, either an Inferno Staff or daggers, and the back bar will be the Maelstrom Inferno Staff. If you can stack in melee for the entirety of the encounter, daggers can squeak out a little more damage, but if you have to dip out some to be in range, front barring a fire staff will be a little bit better. For the traits, we're doing Bloodthirsty on the jewelry, Precise on the front bar if a flame staff, and Infused on the back bar. If sustain is a big issue for you, you can also run Charged on the front bar for the extra burning to proc your combustion passive, but your crit does end up a little bit low in this setup without Precise. However, if you do run daggers, since those get crit chance as well, you can run double charged or Precise charged and still have a nice crit chance level. Precise charge should do ever so slightly more damage if you can sustain it on your daggers, but I couldn't really tell the damage difference between that and double charged, and sustain was much better overall with the 2 charged daggers. For the enchantments, I prefer to do an infused weapon damage enchantment on the back bar and flame damage on the front bar if it is a staff, or flame and poison on the front bar with daggers. If you are running dual staves, you have some options to play with though. For purely single target damage, poison back bar and flame front bar is really nice, or flame back bar and poison front bar for just about the same single target damage and a little better sustain. I really like the weapon damage back bar though for the extra AoE damage. Another thing worth mentioning is that if you already are at the pin cap, maybe you have the new Crimson Oath set or the Alkosh debuff present, running medium on the helmet is slightly more damage than the light piece. Since the recent armor passive changes, this will give you 2% crit damage and 2% spell damage for having that medium piece equipped versus just 1% crit chance for the light piece. Of course, if you do need the pin from the light piece as well, definitely still go that route, and your sustain will be a little bit better with the light piece too. And then finally, for those fights where the kilt is unusable, swap your shoulder piece to your legs and then slot another crit chance piece on the shoulders, or you can drop Slime Craw altogether and run your preferred 2-piece monster set, something like Iceheart or Zon maybe. Another option is to move your ring piece to your leg slot and then run the Death Dealer's Fate Mythic Ring. I really like this option a lot on fights where I don't use the kilt. Not only a good chunk of Magicka for my damage, but a nice big health pool too. Alright, the next setup will be a bunch of good options all crammed together. So Siroria is not always ideal, so I went through and tested a ton of other options and included them here. I know the nerf to Diamond's Victory was not very well received, but it did open up the door for a lot more other sets to be viable options. So we're still going with Slimecraw here, but I did include Valken as well. You shouldn't be enough under the pin cap to need it, but if you are, the pin can be pretty nice to have here. If you are only partially utilizing Valken's bonus to reach the pin cap, still go with Slimecraw. For the body sets, Bahsei is going to be your strongest option here, but some other great options are Mother's Sorrow for a nice amount of crit chance, Heartland Conqueror, which you can really customize your traits with this to get exactly what you need. It is especially nice on DKs because they can use the charged trait very well, so doubling the charged plus precise traits on your front bar or going all in on charged for absolutely insane status effect chance is a really cool option. I think Heartland is decent on some other classes, but seems to stand out a little more on DKs due to their combustion passive. Soaks of the Sun is another nice set that you can body, as nearly all of our damage is flame damage. And then if you do need sustain help, False God is still a nice option. Not the top damaging option, but it's still the best damaging set of the sustain sets. And then for the leg slot, we'll do the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt again. And then for our front bar, staff, or daggers, we can go with Medusa for a bunch of crit chance, Heartland Conqueror again. It also works as a front bar set. Scathing Mage is a nice front bar option, as all of our front bar abilities also have direct damage components to them, and our Flames of Oblivion is also firing out every 5 seconds with our light attack weaves as well. Elemental Succession is pretty good here too, since again most of your damage is flame damage. This will boost a nice chunk of it, and since it lasts 4 seconds it will carry over while you're on your back bar too. Burning Spellweave is a solid option here as well, not as great over a longer fight but still serviceable. And then funny enough, Reliquant is actually really solid as a front bar set even on mag builds. With light armor now giving physical pin alongside of the spell pin, you are actually going to be capped out on both sides, so Reliquant's damage is still very nice. The main drawback is really the weapon crit and stamina bonus lines on it. It would probably be better than Siroria actually if it had spell crit and Magicka instead. And I didn't mention it here because these are kind of the non-Siroria setups, but if you do want to run Siroria front bar, you can do any of those body sets with it as well. And then any of these listed here you can mix and match, so any of the body ones with any of the front barred ones. And finally on our back bar again we'll do the Maelstrom Inferno Staff. And for the fights where you can't use the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt, the same options still apply here as with the first setup shown, either 2 crit monster pieces, a full 2-piece monster set, or the Death Dealer's Fate. So you might notice I didn't bring up Elfbane here, which is a popular DK set. You definitely can still run it, but let me go over a few points about it. Since it does come in heavy and you want it to affect both of your skill bars, you are required to do jewelry and 2 pieces on the body. This works a little awkwardly with the kilt since that is medium and you'll end up with only 4 light pieces, and sustain is going to be pretty rough. If you have a pin set going in your group like Alkosh or Crimson Oath, you can definitely still hit the pin cap with only the 4 light pieces, but overall you do end up giving up a decent amount of stats running the heavy armor. You run into a similar issue if you're using the Death Dealer's Fate Ring, as that's a jewelry piece which forces you into 3 heavy body pieces to use Elfbane on the body. Again, doable, but doesn't seem quite as enticing for damage as it has in some previous patches. If you are running a more traditional 2-piece monster helm setup, I think Elfbane probably works a little better here than the other 2 scenarios I just listed, especially if it's a bonus that Elfbane boosts like Grothdar or Domi House. If Elfbane was a light armor set, I do think it would be super intriguing, but unfortunately the heavy holds it back just a bit. And then one last thing to note, it has been bug reported, but as of the final week of PTS for Waking Flame, this set is not boosting AoE abilities like your Wall of Elements or Eruption or Destro ult, and it's only working for your single target abilities. Hopefully this gets fixed, but if not, definitely going to need to sit it in the bank until it does. Next up, if you want to do a support DPS role for your group, you can run, again, mostly the same setup, except Zen's Redress will now be your front bar set. The strongest combo with this is Bahsei on the body, but we do have alternate body sets that can work as well if you don't have that, or if you find yourself preferring something else. And again, same thing applies for fights where the kilt is unusable. You could also use Medusa here too, but in that case, you'll want to swap Zon to your body set and run Medusa on the jewels in the front bar. So I'll go through the Zen dot requirements later in the skills section, but if you do run Medusa, make sure you still have enough dots since you'll be dropping Barbed Trap. Alright, now let's go over some AoE setups. For the headpiece, again, Slimecraw or Valken are your best options. Valken only if you are needing the extra pin, so will depend on your specific group. For the body, Bahsei, Sorrow, False God, those all work well here. Bahsei is the top damaging of these three, but Sorrow is still a nice option with all the crit that it gives, and False God if you're struggling with sustain. We'll go with the kilt again for our legs, and then for our front bar set, we can go with Acuity or Medusa. Acuity is a little better with shorter pulls, but Medusa might work out a little better for those that linger on for a while, or if you need the extra bar space. I wouldn't run Acuity as your front bar set though if you are running Sorrow on the body, because your Mother's Sorrow 5-piece will be wasted for the whole Acuity proc. You could say this about Slimecraw as well, so if you wanted to run something with spell damage there, that's an option, but if the pulls are lasting a bit longer than your Acuity proc lasts, the crit on Slimecraw can come in handy. And then the same kind of logic here for the front bar trait. If the pulls are really short, Nirn is a little better, but if you're running Medusa or the pulls are lasting a little longer than your Acuity proc, Precise can pull out ahead. For the kilt, all of the same alternates apply that we mentioned before, and then some good alternate sets that you could also use here are Scathing Mage, Burning Spellweave, and possibly Dark Convergence for very short pulls. This is a brand new set, so I haven't seen much testing with it, but it looks like it could be interesting for very quick trash waves. Maybe not a lot of the trial ad waves that have elite enemies that take longer to kill, but I could see it being really good for dungeon ad waves leading up to the bosses. But who knows, maybe it has more use than that too. We'll have to see what people do with it. Seems like a really interesting set though, not only for PvP, but maybe for PvE. So the next two AoE setups I was going to go over both include Elfbane, primarily to boost our Destra ult on our back bar, but as I mentioned earlier, Elfbane is borked at the moment and not boosting AoE, so if that doesn't get fixed, definitely don't use these. But I will have them down in the description along with all of these other setups as always, so if you do want to go over them, they'll be there. And then finally for the solo setup, we'll do either a one-piece Valken or a one-piece Slimecraw. If you are doing overland content or solo arenas, typically you can get enough penetration for most of it with a Slimecraw piece. Overland mobs only have 9100 armor, and solo arena mobs vary, but usually aren't the full 18,200 armor that dungeon and trial enemies have. However, if you are trying to solo 4-man dungeons, that Valken piece will be a little better to get you closer to the pin cap. For the body options, we really have a few good choices here. A lot of those mentioned earlier: Mother's Sorrow, False God's Devotion, Heartland Conqueror, Silks of the Sun, and then if you're trying to squeak out the maximum damage, Bahsei can be a really good option solo too, but will require a little bit more micromanagement. And then we'll be doing the Ring of the Pale Order here. This is just super convenient in a solo setup, as it often allows you to just go with a full damage setup and not worry about having to heal yourself or slotting a shield. And then for the front bar set, Medusa is probably my favorite to just run around with and have an easier time, but other really good options are Heartland Conqueror, Scathing Mage, Burning Spellweave, and Elemental Succession. And then for the back bar, the Maelstrom Inferno Staff, as usual. If you don't have the Maelstrom Staff yet, the normal one is pretty much just as good as the Perfected, and normal Maelstrom Arena is not too difficult to run. But in the meantime, you can just slot another staff of whatever you decided to run on your front bar. And then if you don't want to use the Pale Order ring, you could slot a different mythic ring like the Death Dealer's Fate, or move your chest piece to that ring slot, and then slot whatever other mythic you might want, like Thracian Stranglers maybe, or slot a 2-piece monster set instead of just having the 1-piece. So one more set I wanted to bring up for solo that I think could be really fun but I haven't tested yet is Pelinal's Wrath. The new version of this seems like it might be the new best set for score pushing solo arenas. This definitely isn't my area of expertise, but getting up to 1,000 extra weapon and spell damage sounds pretty nuts. You do constantly take oblivion damage when you have stacks of this, but you also get a shield with each kill that will help offset some of the incoming damage from enemy attacks. The oblivion damage will tick away under the shield, so you'll still need constant incoming healing, but the shield will help to prevent taking too much damage while that's happening. Seems like a pretty fun set. I can see it being really good on classes that have a lot of passive self heals like Magblade, or you could just always pair it with the Pale Order ring. I think it could be good in 4-man stuff too with a healer, but it might be a little dependent on how consistently you can get those kills to keep the stacks going. If you are running solo, you might want to still slot a heal though, even if using Pale Order, because when combat ends, you'll still be taking that Oblivion damage. Alright, let's move on to the skills now. We'll go through a boss setup and then a purely AoE setup. So for the first configuration, our front bar will be running Inner Light, Engulfing Flames, Burning Embers, Molten Whip, Flames of Oblivion, and then Flawless Dawnbreaker. If you don't have Flawless Dawnbreaker unlocked yet, you can still do the Shooting Star here as well, same as previous patches. Since they updated the Fighters Guild line to now give passive spell damage too, Dawnbreaker is slightly better to slot here for the passive bonuses, as well as if you need a cheaper ult to cast because you don't have time to build up for your main backbar ultimate. The Molten Whip morph is really nice here because of the Seething Fury buff that you get, which turns into 225 weapon and spell damage at max stacks when casting other Ardent Flame abilities. So that is why we have all of our other Ardent Flame abilities on the front bar here. I'll go through this a bit more in the rotation later and show how we are setting up the order to maximize that buff. If you do want to run the other morph, Flame Lash, it can also be pretty decent depending on the situation. The main issue is that a lot of groups aren't really prioritizing off balance anymore since you don't get extra damage from it. So you won't be getting any procs of the less expensive, harder hitting component of this skill if off balance is not there. Even if it is, I'd really only suggest that you go with this if you're using it to get a little more sustain, as Molten Whip still does hit a little harder in a properly configured rotation. But running this does also give you the benefit of not having to put all of your Ardent Flame abilities on your front bar, since you aren't concerned with getting Seething Fury stacks. So just something to consider here, but I do recommend the Molten Whip morph for the top damage potential in most cases. For the back bar, we're running Barbed Trap, Unstable Wall of Fire, or Blockade of Fire. So I will have Unstable Wall in my dynamic rotation I show, and then I'll be using Blockade of Fire in my static rotation. And then Mystic Orb or Degeneration. Mystic Orb is a little more single target damage and also is an AoE ability, so greatly increases our overall AoE damage. But Degeneration is a good bit cheaper, so it can help with sustain, and it also provides major sorcery as well if you're not running your traditional spell power potions and don't have a tank running igneous weapons for you. Then we have Eruption, Scalding Rune, and then our backbar ultimate, which will be Standard of Might. Sometimes Destro ult can work better. For example, in Asylum Sanctorium, the boss is not targetable long enough to make use of the full Standard of Might, or maybe a dungeon boss that burns really quickly. Fiery Rage might be a little better there in certain situations. If you can get the full duration off though, Standard of Might is the superior ultimate. Alright, let's go through some notes about the skills. Barbed Trap can be replaced with whatever other skill you need if you're running Medusa. Scalding Rune or Inner Light can be replaced with a shield or a heal if you need those. If you are using alternate potions like Trash Pots or Heroism Pots, either drop Scalding Rune and double bar Inner Light, or swap Trap to your front bar and move Inner Light or Flames of Oblivion to your back bar. Remember, Flames of Oblivion also gives the crit chance buff that Inner Light gives, so as long as you have one of those on each of your bars, you are covered for your crit chance without having it on your potions. I think I slightly prefer having Flames of Oblivion still on my front bar for the extra whip stacks for Molten Whip, but it is really close either way. On my 108k parse, I ran Heroism Potions to help with sustain and ran this exact setup, but with my Inner Light on the back bar and my Barbed Trap on the front bar. Then Degen provided my major sorcery throughout the encounter, so I was good to go on my major buffs. Burning Talons is a really strong dot as well, but without using Elfbane to extend it to 9 seconds, it can be really expensive to keep up. It doesn't seem very practical to sustain for most situations at only 4 seconds long, but there might be some here and there that you can use it on. The Venomous Claw morph can be used instead of Burning Embers if you are having bad sustain issues. It also adds a nice bit of poisoned uptime. I did this and still got 106k DPS instead of 108k, but sustain was noticeably better. So maybe an option for you if you are really struggling with sustain. Force Pulse can be used instead of Molten Whip if you need a ranged spammable, but you will lose some damage at the benefit of freeing up your positioning. Degeneration can also be used on the front bar in place of Inner Light, and you can still use Mystic Orb 2 on the back bar if you want to get even crazier with the number of dots. It should be pretty strong, but I found sustaining Mystic Orb on the trial dummy, even with Heroism Potions, was too tough, so I didn't get to test that particular setup. And then finally, new with the Waking Flame DLC, Revealing Flare and its morphs will now provide major protection passively for having it on your bar. This will take away from your DPS a little bit, but if you're trying to play really safe, something you could consider slotting. That 10% damage mitigation is like getting another preparation passive or the equivalent of roughly 6600 armor. Probably a great tool for soloing some harder content as well, as you'll be able to reduce some of that incoming damage that you can't avoid. So before we move to the AoE setup, let's talk about if you're running Zen's Redress real quick. So this set requires you to have 5 dots applied to your target to max out the effects on it. AoE dots don't count for this, so Wall, Orb, and Eruption won't apply it, but I'll show an example from my Zen Parse here. Engulfing Flames, Barbed Trap, Burning Embers, Degeneration, and Scalding Rune all will. The burning status effect also counts for this, which you should have really good uptime with on MagDK. The poisoned and hemorrhaging status effects also count for this, and double ravage health poisons will too if you are running those. So if you find yourself in a bind needing some more bar space, you don't always necessarily have to have 5 skills for this. Generally, if you're in charge of Zen, you'll want to try and at least have 4 abilities that work for this, and then the burning and other status effect dots can take over that 5th. But if you're really in a bind for bar space, you can run 3 single target dots and let your status effects keep you averaging between 4 and 5 dots instead of over 5 dots, and it won't be a huge difference overall. Alright, now let's go through the AoE skill bar setup. So the front bar is Inner Light and Camo Hunter for the passive boosts, Engulfing Flames, Flame Pulsar or Shock Ring. I do like Flame Pulsar a lot when I can stand in melee in the ads, or if I can't, Shock Ring, and then Deep Breath. Deep Breath is also melee, so again will be best to sub out if you have to stand at range, but it is a really hard hitting AoE ability that you rotate in somewhat similar to how a Warden would Shocks or a Necro Blast Bones. The only issue is you do have to hit with that initial hit for the secondary one to go off, so you can't pre-buff it like Shocks or Blast Bones. And then the same as our last setup, you can do Flawless Dawnbreaker here for the passive bonuses, or Shooting Star if you don't have that unlocked. And then for the back bar, we're doing Proxy Detonation, again another melee ability, Unstable Wall or Blockade of Fire, Mystic Orb, Flames of Oblivion, Channeled Acceleration, and Fiery Rage. So Channeled Acceleration can be dropped for whatever other skill you need if you're running Medusa. Eruption is a good one here and can also replace some of those other skills if you can't be in melee. Proxy Detonation will need to be timed to hit at least 3 targets or it's not worth slotting. And so they changed this skill this patch where it starts off doing much less damage than it used to, but instead of increasing by 25% per enemy hit, it increases by 100% per enemy hit. So this thing is going to be really nasty in big ad packs. You'll just have to get the timing down well when pre-buffing it so that it hits as many enemies as possible. And then if you are using the Master's Lightning Staff for trash, you can drop Pulsar or Shock Ring for Shock Clench. So how this generally looks is you pre-buff your back bar abilities like Proxy Det, Channel Acceleration, and Flames of Oblivion, then you drop your ultimate, and then cast your Wall and Mystic Orb, and then you swap to your front bar, hit the targets with Engulfing Flames to apply the debuff, and then hit Deep Breath and start spamming Flame Pulsar or whatever other spammable you're using. The position you cast your Proxy Det at in your pre-buff will generally move around a little bit based on the timing of the pack that you're running up to, so you just have to get a good feel for it. If pulls aren't consistent though, it will be a little hit or miss with how much this skill does. Alright, now we'll go through the rotations. So first off, we'll go through the fully static version. I used this one with a lot of different setups, so this isn't a definitive ranking of these sets as there is a lot of RNG involved with parsing, but should give at least a decent idea of how they stack up. I'll show another list like this on the dynamic rotation too. And neither of these rotations is limited to a specific gear combo. You can mix and match as you like and use either the static or the dynamic one. So this first one here is using the 14-second morph of Wall of Elements, Blockade of Fire. You can do it with the more common morph, Unstable Wall of Fire, which I'll cover in a bit, but I thought the 14-second version worked out really well with the static rotation as you can pair it perfectly with several other abilities in the rotation and it makes everything line up really well. So for the opening, if you are running Bahsei's Mania and you are comfortable with your sustain levels, you can pre-dump however much Magicka you need with Siege Shield. This doesn't have to be Siege Shield, but this skill costs a lot, so it's easy to put it on your bar and dump quickly and then take it off. So we open up the rotation with 3 casts of Flames of Oblivion. This is just pre-buffing before we ever start actually attacking, so we will get to our 3 stacks of Seething Fury right away. What this does is not only get our whip ready to hit 99% harder, but it adds 225 weapon and spell damage as well, as long as it's kept up. So this rotation will be set up in a very particular way to try and make good use of that buff. Then we'll cast our Scalding Rune and Barbed Trap as the last part of our pre-buff and start our light attack weaving with our Blockade of Fire. Then we're going to swap back to our front bar and apply Engulfing Flames and Burning Embers. If you were quick enough with the Scalding Barbed Trap, and Unstable Wall, then you'll notice when applying Engulfing that your Seething Fury stacks have not fallen off yet. So casting these two abilities here will keep that buff refreshed. And then we'll go back to our back bar, apply Degeneration, cast our ultimate, and then Eruption, and then swap to our front bar to start spamming our Molten Whip. And the first cast here should still have that 99% damage increase buff. So essentially what we're doing is splitting our Ardent Flame cast throughout the opening to keep that buff up the whole time and then still get that hard-hitting whip. After 6 whips, we'll recast Flames of Oblivion and then move into the repeating section of the rotation. If you are in a situation where you can't lay down trap right away, it is a good idea to precast Channeled Acceleration to get that minor force going ahead of time and then just swap it off your bar. Even if you are running Medusa, it's not a terrible idea to still do this, as you'll get the minor force active on your back bar too for the first portion of the fight. So moving into the repeating section, we'll cast Blockade of Fire and Degen together, and then swap forward to cast Engulfing Flames and Burning Embers together, and then back to the back bar to cast Eruption, Scalding Rune, and Barbed Trap together. And then finally we go back to the front bar to spam Whip 7 times, and then end the repeating portion with Flames of Oblivion again. So whenever your ultimate is ready, you'll use it in place of one of those 7 whips and just do 6 whips at that part of the rotation that time through. If you have enough time to build for your Standard of Might ult, that is the superior one to cast, but if not, you might cast the Dawnbreaker instead, so you might mix and match those depending on the specific encounter. And then I wanted to point out that the exact bar swap locations may be slightly different here based on your specific skill bar setup, but the order of the skills will be the same. For example, I was running Barbed Trap on the front bar with Heroism Potions, so my bar swap was after Scalding Rune there in that repeatable section instead of after Barbed Trap. Just something to keep in mind depending on how you set up exactly. And then as I mentioned in the beginning of this, you can do the Unstable Wall morph with this as well. It is slightly more damage, but since it's 10 seconds and not 14 seconds, it doesn't line up as well, so you'll have to keep it up dynamically instead of always having it in that same first slot of the rotation. I do recommend this morph if you are more comfortable with it, as it does a little more damage, but at the end of the day, it won't be a huge difference either way. All right, let's go through some notes. I thought these were important to share about the rotation. I know this video is a little long at this point and this will be a little wordy, but I wanted to try and cram as much info as possible that I thought was relevant. If you are using Degeneration for your major sorcery, so maybe using Trash Pots or Heroism Pots, you can also pre-buff the Igneous Weapon skill to make sure the first few attacks have that sorcery active. This won't be necessary if you have a Dragonknight support role in your group already running this. And as I mentioned earlier, I like splitting up the rotation this way to maximize the uptime on the Seething Fury buff before we consume it with our whip. This also splits up our Empower buffs that we get from casting Mage's Guild abilities and has them land mostly on your front bar light attacks, though that part isn't as important if you have a support role already offering Empower. This does add a little extra bar swapping to the rotation though, which I know not everyone is a big fan of, so there is an even easier way you can do this with less bar swapping. You just cast all of your back bar dots together at once, so your Wall, Degeneration, Eruption, Scalding Rune, and Trap, and then you just cast all of your front bar dots together before your whip spamming phase. If you do this rotation, you will need to move Flames of Oblivion in front of Engulfing, otherwise you won't ever get to your 3 full Seething Fury stacks. So doing it this way, pretty much you get your full stacks and then immediately consume them instead of extending that 225 weapon and spell damage out further over the whole rotation. Definitely doable and makes the rotation easier, but will be just slightly less damage overall, but it is an option. Another small thing you can do if that opening is a little too involved, you can just do those initial 3 Flames of Oblivion casts from the opening and then skip right to the repeating section. The opening burst won't be quite as good, but it will be a little easier to memorize. Then if you're running Medusa, you can ignore all the Barbed Trap stuff in this chart and just have 8 whip spams instead of 7. And then the same concept if you aren't wanting to run Scalding Rune, maybe you need the extra bar space for something else, just ignore that in the rotation and cast 8 whips when you get there instead of 7. If you're running Mystic Orb, and I highly recommend you do for a lot of encounters if you can sustain it. Sustain is pretty horrible right now in the trial dummy, so there was no way I was going to be able to sustain it in the rotation, but if you can in actual content, definitely try and squeeze it in. So the best thing you could do with it would be to keep it up dynamically every 10 seconds, but if you aren't comfortable with that, you could just cast it once per rotation like you were doing with Degeneration for a little lower uptime. And then if you are using the Unstable Wall morph, this will pair nicely with Mystic Orb if you just want to always cast those 2 abilities together. And then finally, we are casting our Eruption and Barbed Trap a few seconds early each time in this rotation to keep it fully static. So if you feel comfortable keeping up a couple of extra abilities dynamically, you can do that with Eruption and Barbed Trap to avoid recasting early. And overall, the more you are comfortable with doing dynamically, the better. I think it is a nice start with the static version, and then you can slowly add in more and more dynamic stuff as you feel more comfortable until you get to a point where you can do the whole thing dynamically, which is the next rotation we'll go through now. So here are all the set combos I tested with the dynamic rotation. Again, not a definitive ranking due to RNG, but lots of good options here. So the opening section here will be very similar to the last rotation. We'll start with the 3 Seething Fury casts again, and finish our pre-buff section with Scalding Rune and Trap, and then start our light attack weaving with Unstable Wall. Then we bar swap to our front bar and cast Engulfing and Burning Embers, then to the back bar to cast Degeneration, drop our ultimate, Eruption, and then swap back to the front to do 4 casts of Molten Whip. And like in the other rotation, we are carrying that Seething Fury buff all the way through our opening until that first whip to keep that 225 weapon and spell damage, and then consume it on the first whip there. At this point, we will swap back and reapply our wall and start keeping up our abilities all dynamically. Again, make sure to precast Channel Acceleration whenever you aren't in a position to have Barbed Trap activating immediately, and also these bar swap locations may be slightly different based on your exact skill setup. Okay, on to the remaining section. So we have a lot of abilities here on different timers, but I'll go into some ways here in a bit that we can group some together to make it a little easier to keep up if needed. Unstable Wall is a big priority to keep up because it keeps up our back bar enchantment, but it also has a really nice direct damage component when you refresh it, so it is a great one to prioritize if you see this and another ability ending together. You could cast this 1 second early and not really lose much damage because you get that nice explosion damage with it. I do have Engulfing Flames next here, as it is a really important group buff to have, but this can be slid down behind Burning Embers if you have multiple people in the group running it and aren't worried about missing a second or 2 here and there. So I do have the 3 Ardent Flame abilities all grouped up here because they are really important to cast to get your Seething Fury stacks, which turn into those harder whip hits. So whenever all of our dots are running and nothing else needs to be reapplied, this is when we'll do our Molten Whip spam. We have a decent amount of casts of this since a lot of our dots have pretty long timers on the Dragonknight. Just make sure to always cast this ability before the Seething Fury buff falls off so you don't waste it. If it is about to run out, this skill jumps up to the top of the priority chart unless it is one of those 3 Ardent Flame abilities that you're needing to recast, which will also refresh the buff. For the ultimate, try and cast it when all of your dots are running and you're entering a phase where you're going to be casting a lot of whips. Being a dynamic rotation, this isn't always going to line up the best, but try to at least not cast it right before you have to refresh a bunch of dots if possible. But since both of our ults we're using last 20 seconds, you will have a good bit of spammables in there regardless. One thing I found myself often doing after the rotation gets going is grouping together my Ardent Flame abilities and casting them together. This does help simplify things a little bit and not have so many different timers that are just all over the place. Remember, after you do this, you don't have to whip right away if you need to cast other dots. You have a little bit before that Seething Fury buff expires. If you are in charge of Zen, your dots that count for that will be your top priority to keep up here. If you have enough with also status effects going, this isn't too much of an issue, but if you are tight for bar space and not running as many single target dots, you'll need to make sure you are really prioritizing them. But overall, don't let this priority order be too scary here. Don't worry too much about it. Just try your best to keep up all of your abilities and not have too many fall off at the same time, and you'll be fine. Just really try hard not to miss those boosted whips. All right, let's go through a few notes for this one. We are almost through all of this, I promise. These first 3 here are the same as the previous rotation, so I won't read through them again. But if you are using Mystic Orb here, which you really should try to fit in if you can sustain it, you'll put that priority for it up between Embers and Trap. And it can be paired with Wall if you want to simplify that a bit, since those are both 10 seconds. So that kind of leads into this next section, which is about pairing stuff together. If you aren't comfortable doing everything on an individual timer, you can start putting things together and have sort of a mix between a static and dynamic rotation. As I just mentioned, Wall and Orb pair well together at 10 seconds each. Your Ardent Flame abilities can be cast every 15 seconds to always match up, and then Barbed Trap and Eruption can be cast every 18 seconds together. Having a lot of stuff grouped up will lead to more moments where you have dots falling off for extended periods, since you will be stuck in a small static section casting things, but it may make things a little easier to manage overall. Alright, that's going to do it for this guide. I had a lot of fun with this one. I really love DKs a lot, and I hope this helps you get a little more out of yours. I want to give a big thanks to my current Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see how you can help support the channel through Patreon, I'll have a link down in the description below. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Privy League Guild on PlayStation's EU server, Cougar is Bay and the Cougar City Guild, Gandalf Legreese, Stridig, Delta, the Order of War Guild, and finally my wonderful wife. I'll close this one out with a few parses using the setups I showcased. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.
Sounds, use coffee grounds to stop the hounds. Telling what I'm hiding underneath my skinny face. Now, in very, very people, with so many, many should leave us unafraid to die. Letting go of all religion, letting go of superstition now. And very, very free fall with so many, many people. $3.80. Complete your payment transaction. Chili, chili, chili.